Hello there. This is Kellendir from Kellendir's Corner, and today we are going to be talking about arrowheads. Specifically, we are going to be talking about the specificities of arrowheads because they are not all the same, and it's actually a very interesting topic where there is a significant amount of differentiation between various types of arrowheads and what they're actually supposed to do and what you use them for. So, without further ado, let us talk about just how many types of arrowheads there actually are. Ultimately, we have two large categories, and then sort of the miscellaneous other category that everything else falls into. In the real world, that is. Historically speaking, you mostly have bodkins, broadheads, and then everything else. In a fantasy world, well, that changes. So, bodkins. They're thin, they taper, they're narrow. The barbs or the waist or the hips, or there's so many different terms for arrow parts because historically nobody really agreed. And in the modern day and age, you have all of these different archaeologists who will give different naming schemes. So I may occasionally use some of the terms interchangeably, but the area where the arrowhead, so we start off at the tip, and then the area where the arrowhead flares out somewhat, because almost every arrowhead does this. That is the waist, the hips, the barbs, the lots of terms. The area where the arrowhead flares out tends not to flare out all that much on a bodkin. It still almost always flares, though. It is incredibly rare to see a arrowhead that is just a spike. So keep that in mind. These are bodkins. They are good for punching through things. They don't punch through everything, though. We'll talk about that. Some bodkins are shorter, more robust, less likely to bend or misalign and not punch through the thing you're trying to poke a hole in. That's also something very important to their function. But let's contrast them with broadhead arrows. Broad-headed arrows are, well, exactly what they sound like. Arrows where the arrowhead is significantly broader than a bodkin. They generally maximize a cutting surface, and they cleave a very large wound channel through their target. I did a video a little while ago about how arrows bleed people in horrific ways. Yeah, these are the arrows that do the most of that. Broadhead arrows are incredibly common. In fact, broad-headed arrows tend to be the most common type of arrow ever invented by humanity. Interestingly enough, the fishing arrow is realistically like the second most common type of arrow. Some very interesting stuff there, followed by some of the other specialized hunting arrows. And this does really lead us into that miscellaneous other category, because fishing arrows are in many cases the largest of the miscellaneous arrow types. Fishing arrows are all designed with one thing in mind: retaining the fish after you have shot it. And there are many methods of doing this. You can have a number of prongs on the arrow that stick into the fish, and then they are barbed and don't let go. You can have an arrowhead that punches cleanly through the fish and then detaches from the arrow itself, the arrow shaft, and the string is tied to the arrowhead. The fish tries to swim away, but as the fish is swimming, the line pulls, the arrowhead goes, it hits it, and then drags the fish as you pull it into shore, which is a really interesting way of doing it. All sorts of methods for retaining fish have been attempted with some amount of success by humans at various time periods. Fishing arrows are often one of the most varied and interesting categories of arrow. We then have a whole bunch of blunted arrows, mostly for hunting small game, because realistically, if you drove a broadhead through a squirrel, well, how much squirrel would be left? And you'd probably wreck things pretty awfully, like you'd get all the entrails soaking into the meat, and that's really bad. That can poison you, you can do all sorts of horrible stuff. You really don't want that. A blunt arrow will kill or at least stun the animal. You can go and collect it at your leisure, depending upon how brutally you conk it over the head. And these arrows are generally used for hare, for other small mammals, sometimes for birds. Though there's also another type of arrow specifically made for killing birds, which has a very long broadhead blade on it and effectively decapitates the bird. That gets pretty graphic. So yeah, keep that in mind before you go looking for bird decapitating arrows. It's a real thing. It is a very real thing. And generally speaking, beyond like blunted practice arrows, which rely on the fact that what might seriously wreck a small animal will not necessarily wreck a person, these tend to be the major categories of arrows. So, what's the real differences here? How can I sum this up to make this useful information for you, the novelist, the game designer, the dungeon master? Well, broadheads are the most common type of arrow ever made by humans. Different species, well, that's up to you. But for humans, broad-headed arrows are the most common. They are generalist arrows. They can be relatively slim and be decent at punching through armor, but still clear a pretty unfortunate wound channel through a person. They can be very, very broad, with the blade having sweeping edges and be designed for really messing up the mounts that enemies might be riding. That's a very real-world application, if a horrible one. They can be generalized hunting arrows. They have a lot of uses. This is probably the most generic type of arrow out there. Bodkins tend to stray away from hunting. Why would you hunt with a bodkin? We'll get to that. In a fantasy world, you might. And they tend to specialize in punching through various types of armor. Thinner, longer, pointier bodkins are generally going to punch through mail like it's not even there, effectively. There is going to be relatively little lost penetration punching through most types of mail if you have a long, slim, needle nose bodkin. So, that's a use case right there. Stouter bodkins, where the tip is less likely to deform, these tend to target harder armors. That being said, understand, bodkin does not mean it inherently punches through armor. The armor's thickness, how well it's crafted, these things all play a strong part in determining whether the arrow will actually go through the armor, and what in many cases plays an even more important role is how powerful is the bow that the arrow was loosed from, and how strong is the arrow shaft. If the arrow shaft is not strong enough to take the strain of the arrow hitting the armor, the arrow will actually effectively explode, which happens pretty commonly when arrows hit plate armor. So, that's bodkins. The other types of arrows, the hunting arrows, and the blunted tournament arrows or the sport arrows, well, those are mostly self-explanatory. They each go specifically and are used to hunt their specific type of game. Fishing arrows, you hunt fish with them. Fowling arrows, you hunt fowl. Arrows for small game, the blunted ones, you hunt small game, right? Hare, squirrel, so on and so forth. Those ones tend to be very easy. Which brings us to a bit of a problem that fantasy settings can have, which is that hunting arrows are not war arrows and should not be treated as such. Hunting arrows are generally lightweight. They're not meant to be fired off of incredibly powerful bows. Loosed, I should say. There's no gunpowder here. These hunting arrows tend not to have armor penetrative qualities. They tend to be broadheads designed to bleed the creature swiftly. Do not confuse your hunting arrows with arrows that are good for punching through armor. A normal woodsman who is not expecting to get attacked and has his trusty longbow probably doesn't have, unless your setting calls for it, probably doesn't have any war arrows with him. Which means that even chainmail is suddenly a major impediment to his arrows. I cannot overstress how badly very broad-bladed arrows fare against metal armor. They fare incredibly poorly. So it is very important to remember, the hunting arrows are good for hunting, they are not good for war. Some types of arrows are only ever good within their specific context. Fishing arrows, by their very nature, all those gimmicks designed to catch and hook a fish, inherently tend to make them very bad at killing people. Most fishing arrows are going to have a very difficult time doing more than seriously injuring a person, even if loosed from a very powerful bow. It's even worse when you get to relatively blunt arrows for small game. Important things to know, these things can play a role in your story. Archers can be out and about hunting, not expecting to get attacked. They get attacked and they're overwhelmed. Their arrows aren't good for this encounter, and as such, they fail to defend themselves in a pretty spectacular fashion. It can add nuance and depth to your fantasy world. So, now let's talk about something I brought up a little bit earlier, about how, you wouldn't go out hunting with bodkins, except, what if you're hunting something with an armored carapace? Now bodkins might make a lot of sense. Fantasy creatures oftentimes require arrows that would normally be loosed at armor, because fantasy creatures so often do have various forms of natural armor. There are also fantasy creatures where arrows just really don't cut it. Literally. Undead? The idea that you can harm most undead with arrows is kind of insane. So, do understand that, as I referenced in my previous video, probably link it down below, arrows do a lot of their damage because of the bleeding that they deal. You can't bleed the undead, generally, and as such, arrows have incredibly limited use against them. And frankly, in most cases are going to be almost completely ineffective. However, arrows are actually going to be very effective against flying foes, even if you don't hit a wing. If you get some broadhead arrows designed for taking down mounts into the forelegs of a griffin, for example, you may very well bring it out of the skies, because to remain relatively aerodynamic, a griffin must keep a folded posture with its legs, streamlining itself. As the muscles tear and work their way through the various bits of shoulder muscle that they've wedged into, the griffin might lose the ability to keep that leg furled. And now the leg is dragging and throwing it off balance, and it's constantly having to correct. There will come a point where that damage is too much, and the creature is forced to land. So bringing down aerial threats with arrows is actually a very realistic thing that you can have happen in your worlds. What I need you to do, because I personally am aggrieved when I see this misuse, so for my sake, what I need you to do is to contextualize your arrows. What do these people hunt? What do these people go to war with? Okay, I'm going to go and I am going to give them arrows that are good for hunting these creatures and going to war with these other peoples. And if you do that, you will add a whole load of depth to your world. Arrows don't always work against certain types of armor. Arrows aren't all universally used to hunt the same things, and arrows aren't universally used for the same sports. Because arrows are used for sport. And especially once you introduce magic, there are all sorts of interesting games you can invent. Archery games that we could never have in our world that can flourish in a fantasy setting. So that's really what I want to leave you with. There will be a couple more videos coming out about arrows. I will be going over a number of types of arrows that I personally have placed into various fictional worlds and the way they work, and I would encourage you to check that video out and see if there are any arrows that you want to borrow, or at the very least to check the video out to see what goes into making interesting enchanted or alchemical or otherworldly arrows that don't just occur in a history book. But until then, be clever and be kind, and may you have a wonderful, just absolutely wonderful rest of your day.